How to overcome anxiety. If you're watching this video, there is a very good chance that anxiety is currently playing a very big part in your day-to-day life. And I know exactly how that feels. I have personally been through anxiety, and thankfully I'm now out the other side. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you the two most effective strategies that I use to overcome anxiety. Now, initially, we're just going to have a quick explore into anxiety, what it is and how it works, so that when we get to the strategies that I use to overcome anxiety, it all makes sense together. So anxiety is your brain's way of trying to keep you safe. And it's important to remember this, as often it feels like our brain is working against us. Your brain's number one job is to keep you alive, not to keep you happy. So when you do get those moments where you feel like your brain is on top of you, remember, it's just trying to keep you alive. It's trying to keep you safe. It's not trying to hurt you or make you unhappy. Anxiety is a completely normal human emotion, and it's something that we all experience. So we shouldn't be looking to cure or eradicate anxiety. Now, anxiety can become a problem, and there are two things I look for when deciding whether anxiety is a problem or not. Number one, is it impacting your well-being? Are you feeling just overwhelmed on a day-to-day basis and anxiety feels like it's controlling your life? And also the choices you make. If anxiety is impacting the choices you make on a day-to-day basis, that is a very clear sign that it's time to do something about it. So how did your anxiety start? This is kind of a broad stroke approach, but this is usually how it works. You would have had a specific experience that triggered a very strong negative emotional response in your body. So what does that mean? Well, something happened, an event, a situation happened. You were in that situation. So for example, let's say you were in the supermarket. You started feeling a bit overwhelmed. You started feeling fearful and panicky, and you just wanted to get out of there, right? So what your mind does is it stores that very strong negative emotional response of fear and panic with the trigger, the supermarket. So those things are connected together. The brain stores and links the emotional response to the trigger. So when you encounter that trigger again, or even just thinking about that trigger, so when you go to the supermarket again, or when you think about going to the supermarket, or if you even think about doing something closely related to going to the supermarket, your brain will recall those negative emotions that you experienced at that time and send them straight back to you. This is your brain trying to get you to avoid doing that thing again, as it's trying to keep you safe. Remember, the brain's number one job, keep you safe, keep you alive. So by flooding you with these emotions related to the memory that you had, there's a very good chance that you're going to avoid doing that thing. And this is the avoidance that will fuel the anxiety. And this is where it's very difficult to break this cycle. So the natural response to any negative emotional event, such as a panic attack at the supermarket, is to want to avoid going through that again. You want to avoid those negative emotions. That's completely normal. It's completely understandable. So this leads to avoiding the triggers that can cause them. Not all triggers can be avoided, and we're going to cover that in a bit more detail on the next slide. So in most cases, you're actually avoiding the emotions rather than a trigger. So you're not scared of the supermarket. As much as it feels that way, you're not scared of the supermarket. You are fearful of feeling that way again, because when you're overwhelmed with anxiety, it is very, very uncomfortable and fearful. So avoidance can bring short-term relief. This is why avoidance is very, very common if you have anxiety, because your brain says this is a danger, don't do it. So you don't do it, so you feel relief, so you feel good, and then your brain feels like it's kept you safe, so your brain's happy as well. So avoidance works in the short term. It makes you feel better, it makes your brain happier. But often in the long term, it makes things worse, as it just reinforces that anything your brain is currently perceiving as a danger, that it's accurate, and it will continue to do so. So what can we do about this? Well, there are two ways to overcome anxiety, and then depending on the type of trigger, there are two main approaches. So the first type of trigger, we're going to try to change your emotional response to the trigger through something called exposure. So in the supermarket example, we're going to try and change the connection between the trigger, the supermarket, and the emotional response, the panic and fear that you felt. And we're going to do that through exposure. Now, for the other type of trigger, we're going to try to change your relationship with the emotional response. So instead of trying to change your connection between the trigger and the emotional response, we're going to try and change the way we feel about their emotional response instead. So it depends on the type of trigger, which way we approach it. But for many triggers, you can choose to do both. And again, this will make more sense as we go through the examples. So the first type of triggers are triggers within your control, or triggers that you may class as avoidable triggers. So with these types of triggers, we're going to focus on changing our emotional response to the trigger. So with the supermarket, we're trying to change that response that we get when we're at the supermarket. So examples of avoidable triggers. We have social situations, because you can choose not to go to the social situation. Maybe driving or flying is something that's very anxiety inducing for you, so you avoid doing it. Maybe you avoid going to open spaces, which is agoraphobia. Maybe you don't like public speaking, so you don't do it. Or maybe you avoid physical sensations. So some people avoid increasing their heart rate and doing exercise because they fear they can have a panic attack when they start experiencing those physical sensations. So these triggers are within your control. They are avoidable triggers. And with these types of triggers, we use exposure. So exposure is gradually facing the things that currently make you anxious until that emotional response begins to lose power. So again, going back to the supermarket example, I'm not saying go straight back to the supermarket and stand there for 10 minutes until you feel better. That's not how exposure works. Often the things that you are avoiding, if you go and do them, they will be overwhelming. So we need to break them down into baby steps. So as a very quick example with the supermarket scenario, maybe day one, you just go to your car, you go and sit in your car for a few minutes and you come back. Day two, maybe you'd drive to the supermarket car park and then drive back. Day three, you'd go to the supermarket and you'd walk in, you'd stand in there for a minute and then you leave. Day four, you go to the supermarket and walk around and then leave. And then maybe day five, you go in there and then you try and buy something. So gradually you build it up until that anxious response starts to calm down. And that is how exposure works. And that's why it works really well for these avoidable triggers, because at the moment you're choosing not to do them. And instead you're going to expose yourself to them. And over time, they will begin to lose their power. Now, we also have triggers outside of your control. These are the unavoidable triggers. And for these types of triggers, we want to focus on changing our relationship to the emotional response, because the exposure element is largely outside of our control with these types of triggers. But what we can change is how we relate to the emotional response we get from those triggers. So examples of unavoidable triggers. Maybe you have a chronic health condition that you can't do anything about. Other people's behavior, as much as we'd like to try and change it, often we're powerless to other people's behavior. Maybe you've recently experienced loss or grief, or you have painful memories of trauma in the past. Or maybe you have family responsibilities. You've got children or look after elderly parents. The types of triggers that you have very little control over. So with these types of triggers, we use acceptance. So instead of exposure, we use acceptance. And acceptance is learning to make room for difficult emotions. So we're not trying to avoid them or get away from them. We know they're going to be there, and we are learning how to sit with them. And at the same time, we're focusing on living our life to our values. We're living the type of life that we want to live. That's the most important thing with this. So we're making room to feel those uncomfortable sensations in response to those triggers. Now, as I said earlier on this slide, for many triggers, you can choose to do both. So for example, some of the triggers that are within your control, if you are going to the supermarket and you know you're going to start feeling anxious, you're doing the exposure, but you can also do the acceptance where you're acknowledging that I'm going to feel this way when I do this exposure. You're accepting how it's going to make you feel because it's in pursuit of trying to improve your life. So acceptance and exposure do go together and will often be used together for many, many triggers. So these are two of the most powerful strategies you can use to overcome anxiety. And like I said, I've used them myself to overcome anxiety, and I still use them to this day. Now, if you want to find out more about acceptance and exposure and how to do them in detail, make sure you subscribe to the channel. This is my first video on this channel, so I'll be covering a lot of this in more detail in future videos. And if you're interested in working with me, there'll be a link to my website in the pinned top comment and in the description.